Good morning and welcome to EPG Pathshala. We're looking at the paper on English literature from 1590 to 1798, and today we are looking at the lesson on Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. I'm Anna Kurian and I teach at the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. Now, when we look at Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, we are then thinking in terms of a text that is positioned at the beginning of the period when the novel first becomes an accepted form in English literature. So when people try to trace the form of the novel, they bring it from antique times, classical times, right down to the contemporary in the 18th century. It begins, of course, far earlier with classical texts in Greek and Latin, but one of the texts which is supposed to be very influential on the rise of the novel is Don Quixote by Cervantes. And this is translated into English in 1612 and is supposed to have been one of the major influences on the English novel. But in addition to this, there are other texts such as Thomas Nash's Unfortunate Traveller and Delaney's text as well in the Elizabethan era, all of which were seen to have been precursors to the English novel. Now, before we begin to talk about Robinson Crusoe in detail, we'll briefly consider Daniel Defoe, his life and his works. Now, Defoe lived from 1660 to 1731 and is seen alongside John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Robinson Crusoe is seen as one of the best examples of the early novel. Now, he was born in London. He attended an academy for dissenters in his initial days, and that itself should tell us something, that he was not in the accepted frame of religion of the period. Now, when the economy collapsed in 1662, soon after the return of Charles II to the throne, he himself, Defoe, had severe losses which he had to bear, and he had difficulty in paying off his debts. And during that period and soon after is when he's writing variously, writing a lot, and amongst his major texts are, of course, Robinson Crusoe, which is at the center, but there is also Moll Flanders, which tells us a story of a woman and her travels and travails in the world. Then we have Captain Singleton and several other texts as well during this period which he writes. And the ones which are usually counted as important are Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, and A Journal of the Plague Year, all of which are seen as central to the canon of Daniel Defoe. Now, the novel comes to rise during this period due to certain social conditions. One is, of course, the rise of the middle class during this period. But even as it comes to be during this period, it also borrows from the medieval romance and several of the successors of the medieval romance. And as we've already mentioned, Cervantes's Don Quixote is one of the crucial influences upon the rise of the novel because it gives to us the picaresque tradition. Now, the picaresque tradition, the story of a rogue and his adventures. Now, it could be episodic, as in each adventure could stand separately, only connected by the central figure who is the hero of the story or the protagonist of the story. Now, Cervantes's Don Quixote and his little friend Sancho Panza and his horse, as they go from adventure to adventure to adventure, each of those adventures are complete in themselves. And it's a loosely knit story which is being told, and the common elements are the characters. And this is the picaresque tradition, which also is then inherited by the English novel. But the English novel also rises due to an interest in realism during this period, that instead of earlier associations with non-realistic elements, now people wanted a more realistic storyline. And that advent of realism is also important because of the rise of the middle class, because the middle class wanted to see their own kinds of lives being told in story form. So that is when common people make their entry into the life of literature, that it's not just for the higher classes, but ordinary people can also have their stories told in literature. Now, Defoe's novels are chiefly written in the picaresque tradition. The idea of the picaro was adapted to the 18th century by Daniel Defoe, where he was no longer a feudal outcast, but somebody who belonged to the society. And this is, of course, a market-based economy that we're talking about, because this is also a transitional period when we are moving from the earlier feudal economy and the feudal systems into a world which is slowly being powered by the Industrial Revolution and the bourgeoisie actions of society. So when Defoe is beginning to write, he is also showing us a person who is not just somebody who has left a feudal system and is wandering through the world, but somebody who's making his way in the world in terms of economics and the way in which he conducts his life so that he has a more prosperous life. Now, in his novels, and if you were to look at it, Robinson Crusoe would be an example, but so also would Moll Flanders, he gives us various episodes of the protagonist's life, and which is why we keep saying that it's in the Picaresque tradition. And it shows us how they move from an embedded in society outlook to an individualistic outlook wherein they are able to shape themselves and consider himself or herself from their own perspective. So there's this very individualistic framework within which Daniel Defoe operates in his work. As in, it's not always only about society, but about an individual in society and how the individual will see himself and how the individual will portray himself. And he arrives at the individual, whether Moll Flanders or Robinson Crusoe, arrives at an understanding of himself or herself at the end of the novel, by which time he knows exactly what he is and how to face the world. Now, briefly then, let us consider the overview of Robinson Crusoe. We look at the plot structure, what exactly happens in the text. It, of course, revolves around a protagonist who doesn't want to stay at home. He wants to travel the world, change his life, change his destiny. It begins with an individual who is not content to be his father's son. And Robinson Crusoe is actually not content to be his father's son. He wants to go off and do his own stuff. So it begins with an individual who is not content to be his father's son and who would rather travel the world and make his own way in the world. Now, it's interesting because Robinson Crusoe also on his first voyage goes with a friend. But the friend is so disheartened by the kinds of troubles that they have that he decides that he's knowing no more voyaging. He's had it. He wants to stay back home. But Crusoe does not then decide this. He says, never mind the troubles that he had, he will still voyage along. So his father, of course, gives him good advice to say that stay here, be here, stay with what we have and be happy. But he decides that he has to travel. And he goes, first of all, he sets out to go to London. And then later on, he will then travel all over the world as well. Now, initially, like I said, as he goes with his friend and a storm nearly causes the death of both the friend and himself, the friend, of course, goes back. But Crusoe decides that he cannot go back and he sets himself up as a merchant on a ship and he leaves London. He, of course, makes some money and so on and so forth. So this is a successful voyage. He undertakes another voyage. This time around, he leaves the money that he has made with a widow whom he trusts, and he sets out once again on his voyages. And this voyage is not quite so successful. So on this, the second voyage, he is once again captured and he's made a slave. For 2 full years, he slaves in the house of the captain of the ship that took him. And his ship is captured by pirates. The pirate lord takes him home. And there you have Robinson Crusoe as slave. When he finally escapes from that slavery, he doesn't do so alone. But he takes with him a black boy, Zuri. Now, again, interesting because if you think about it, he himself has been a slave. But when he escapes, he takes with him another slave. Now, is that second slave, Zuri, going to be free or is he going to be Robinson Crusoe's slave is the question. Now, he and Zuri then are taken on board a ship, and after many days they reach an island, and there they board a Portuguese slave ship which is going to Brazil. And this is where things get interesting because does Zuri belong to Robinson Crusoe or is Zuri a free agent is the question which will then need to be answered within the text. What happens is that the captain of the ship buys Crusoe's boat, and Crusoe very happily sells Zuri also to him to be his slave. So what we see is already the race relationships have been put in place. Zuri was black, Crusoe was white. Both of them were slaves to their Moorish pirate lord. But when Crusoe escapes, he helps Zuri to escape. But Zuri does not escape as a free agent. He escapes as a slave to Crusoe, whom Crusoe then sells. So the black man cannot then get his own freedom. The black man can get his freedom only if the white man gives it to him. And Crusoe does not give it to him. So what Crusoe does is he sells Zuri to the new ship's captain, and he says, after 10 years, you can set him free. So the determiner of the future of the black man is always, of course, the white man. Then, of course, the boat lands in Brazil. Crusoe settles down. He once again makes a happy-ish life for himself, simple middle class, so on and so forth, but content. And he once again decides that he will go out on one more voyage. This time, he will voyage to West Africa to seek his fortune. Now, this time, ends up again shipwrecked, and ends up shipwrecked on what he thinks is an uninhabited island. Now, when he first wakes up on this island, Robinson Crusoe is assailed by a lot of troubles, as in he feels depressed naturally. He's the only guy left alive and he's on this island where there's nothing. But then, in true tradition of the shipwrecked sailor, he discovers that he doesn't really have to worry so much because the ship on which he was coming was right there, quite close. And so he makes voyages after voyages to the ship and takes from it tools which will help him survive, food which will help him survive. He even finds animals on the ship which he can use so that they will then help him to live fairly comfortably on the island, and how he will make a life for himself. It is at this point that the narrative of Robinson Crusoe as we know it really begins, because he is on this island which he believes is uninhabited, and we are told in great detail about how he survives on the island. Providence, as he claims, gives him everything that he needs. Basically, what gives him everything that he needs is the wrecked boat, which is fairly close to him. And it is from the boat that he collects all the things that he needs. But from it, he manages to collect enough to live a fairly comfortable life on his island. He transforms that island into his empire. And he believes that this is the place where he can exert his authority and nobody will question it. All of this comfortable life comes to an end one morning when he sees a human footprint on the sand near his place. And he gets paranoid that how can a human footprint have appeared there, because it's not his footprint, somebody else's footprint. Oh my gosh. So he is like so scared, and he's confirmed that he begins to fear that the island is inhabited and may be inhabited by cannibals. Now, of course, he is caught up in a struggle where he has to make sure that he is safe and that his command of the island is not taken away from him by somebody else. It is at this point that finally one day he discovers the cannibals. He discovers that they have people with them whom they are going to sacrifice, and he rescues one of them, a man whom he names Friday. And that man then becomes his slave. So the rescue of Friday is then the turning point. Till now, if Robinson Crusoe has been living on an uninhabited island and making it comfortable for himself, with the rescuing of Friday, he now gets somebody whom he can rule over. So till now, he has not been a master to anybody. But from this point onwards, Friday is his servant or his slave, as you will see. Now, once he rescues Friday, it's interestingly enough, the first word that he teaches Friday is master. He teaches him to address him as master, and Friday, of course, is extremely grateful to him because he has been rescued from being eaten. So naturally, he will be grateful. But he is also happy because he has somebody to serve, somebody to look up to. And Robinson Crusoe teaches him the English language, and he teaches him religion, the Christian religion. And the both of them live together fairly contentedly on their little island. For 3 years, they live together, and Friday is a slave to Robinson Crusoe. He is also, and this is of course where the post-colonial critics will take it later on, Friday is the colonized subject as opposed to Crusoe, who is the white master. Now the two of them live until such time as one more ship arrives, and one more set of savages is found over there, and this time they have with them 2 captives, one of whom is Friday's father, the other one is a Spaniard. And now what we have is the rescue of the Spaniard and Friday's father, and now Crusoe continues to live, after rescuing these two, he continues to live on the island along with his 3 subjects. But the earlier comfortable zone in which he was is slightly disrupted because he is no longer very sure as to whether the Spaniards will side with him. They are, after all, not Protestant, they are Catholic. They might then not be very happy with him, and how will he deal with them? So that the completely comfortable tenor of life that he enjoyed when it was just him and Friday is now disrupted. And finally, he decides that he should have all the Spaniards on his side so that he doesn't have to worry. And he then sets in motion events which will lead to this conclusion. But even during this period, when he lives as king on the island, he's very comfortable because he rules the island and he believes that the island is his and his alone. They have good harvest. They live comfortably here on the island. Now, finally, then you have Crusoe, who sends off Friday's father and the Spaniard and says that get the other Spaniards as well. But before they return, Friday spots an English ship. So when he sees this English ship, Crusoe then realizes that there is a mutiny on board and 3 men are sent to shore. So the 3 men are rescued then by Crusoe, and he eventually rescues the ship itself from the mutineers. Now, this again helps him to be in a position of power. So what we see repeatedly is the intervention of Crusoe, which is always an intervention which leads to him being in a position of power over other people. Whether those other people are the cannibals, whether those other people are Spaniards, or now in this case, whether those other people are the Englishmen themselves. Now, pretending then to be the governor of the island, he seizes a ship, and finally then, of course, he goes back to England on his ship after 28 years living on an island. First initially alone, then later on with Friday, later on with other people as well. And he gets back to London and he finds that his money is still safe with that widow with whom he had left it. And he's quite content because he has now had a really rich and varied life. And he goes back to his plantations in Brazil and settles down to a stable life. Then once again, he goes on one more voyage, this time leaving behind his children, etc., etc. He goes on a voyage and he visits his own island, and there he finds that there is a thriving colony which has been set up over there and which is being run there, and so on and so forth. And this, more or less, is how Robinson Crusoe is, the text is from beginning to end. This is the overview of the plot. Robinson Crusoe has a crucial place in the history of the novel because it incorporates in it many of the strands which we see as significant even today. Now, we begin with the idea that it is indebted to travel books, and this becomes important because also this is still, if the age of travel and discovery, exploration and discovery was the late 16th and early 17th centuries, we are talking in terms of a time when still travel was seen as crucial to the identity of the Englishman. But it was not a travel which only led to exploration and discovery, but it was a travel which led to colonialism and the establishment of an English empire. So, when we look at Robinson Crusoe, we are then seeing images of the beginnings of that empire, which are given to us by the novel itself. So, one, it is indebted, of course, to travel books, but it's also a highly scientific work, which is full of facts and figures. In fact, if you read some of Robinson Crusoe, what you find is that he gives exact details of what he brought from his wrecked ship, how he used it, what exactly he planted, and always we are also given this kind of missionary narrative wherein he tells us about how God is the one who helped him to do this. Then Crusoe is also emblematic of the age because he is an archetype of the Homo economicus, which is an interesting way of thinking about somebody who is only interested in economic details. So everything for him is rendered in terms of profit and loss, debit and credit, the double entry bookkeeping system, which is common to a nation of shopkeepers. Now, if you think of England as being a nation of shopkeepers, then Crusoe is emblematic of that nation because he sees everything in those kinds of terms. He is also, of course, a second Adam, and this is something which we will go back to because the idea of Adam who makes his own life, who builds a paradise, or who was in a paradise, the Garden of Eden. Here you have Robinson Crusoe, who on an uninhabited island is able to build his own little paradise over there for himself. Then, of course, the novel emphasizes, reinforces the idea of individualism and private enterprise. And this, of course, is seen in Robinson Crusoe. The idea of the individual as being central and as being important is given to us over and over again, also because Crusoe is always returned to civilization, but he does not stay in civilization. He does not stay in society. Instead, he once again travels away from it, and it is his own individual life and what he makes of that life that is important. And private enterprise also because he had the possibility of living a comfortable life on what his father was willing to give him. But instead of adapting or adopting that life, he decides that he will himself set out on these enterprises, and with his own entrepreneurial enterprise, he will then make his own life. And if you notice, what we have is after his second voyage, when he comes back, he has money. He leaves it with that widow. Then he sets out on his third voyage and he is able to set up plantations for himself. Eventually, when he returns with Friday and so on and so forth, he is again prosperous. So he constantly reinforces the idea that personal enterprise and individualism can be successful. In all of these matters, Robinson Crusoe is then seen as typical of the age, that it was an age which rewarded the individual who was willing to work for his own improvement and make a life for himself, in which society is important, yes, but the individual is more important, and what the individual does with his life is more important. Then, of course, there is the idea that Robinson Crusoe can master nature. And this is where the post-colonial critics especially step in, because what we see in after years is how the novel is always read as an example of the colonial enterprise. That here is this white man, specifically here is this English white man, who then travels out, who finds an island and decides that this is his island, this is his kingdom. It does not matter that there were already people who lived there. Now, the cannibals who lived on this so-called uninhabited island may not have been nice people. I mean, they eat each other, but they are still human beings and they have their own culture, their own civilization. But because Robinson Crusoe has landed there, it becomes his island and he is the one then who rules over it. There are several elements to this which are important, because what we see is that it is symbolic of England's own rise as a new empire which is slowly spreading out across the globe. And because of Crusoe's interactions with Friday and the other cannibals and the Spaniards, we also see the complex colonizer-colonized relationship which plays out on that island. It's also important because that when Crusoe reaches that island and he decides that there is nobody living there, he also then works with the notion that the island is uninhabited because there is no farming taking place on the island. Nobody has done any gardening. And this is something which comes to us from the establishment of empires and colonies across the world, because people said that the land was uninhabited if the land was not being farmed or not being used for agriculture. And this is how the English, when they go to the Americas, they decide that the Americas are empty because the Native American Indians never used to practice farming of the kind that the Englishmen did. So it is in a similar fashion that Robinson Crusoe then takes the island, because he says there is nothing happening here, nothing growing here, nobody is growing anything over here. Therefore, when he begins to grow something, it is automatically his island. Post-colonial studies have been concerned with various aspects of Robinson Crusoe. In fact, Robinson Crusoe is a cult text for the post-colonial critic because of its representation of the Englishman as he sets out to colonize an uninhabited island, but also because of the representation of a European/Englishman interacting with other Europeans, as in the Spaniards, but also with other people from other cultures. So whether it is Zuri, the black boy, Friday the cannibal, or any of the others whom he encounters, it gives us a lot of that. We have had reworkings of Robinson Crusoe in several texts. Most famously, of course, you have Walcott's pantomime, but you also have Coetzee's Foe, and you have other texts as well, all of which are then responses to Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Now, we will briefly look at the characters in the text, and we begin, of course, with the central character, Robinson Crusoe himself. Now, Crusoe is, of course, the eponymous hero, but he is also the character around whom everything happens in the book. So he is also the character who will determine his own fate. He does not allow anybody else to have a chance of determining his fate. So he takes on complete control over his own life. So he is then, in that sense, a Defoe protagonist who attempts to root culture in nature and the uninhabited island which he eventually lands up on and where he lives for his 28 years. That is a natural surrounding. In that natural surrounding, when he is able to bring order, agriculture, when he makes a little home for himself, when he gardens over there, when he sets up his goat and his dog over there, all of those are indicative of the establishment of culture in nature. Then, of course, the fact that he begins with rebelling against his father's middle-class dreams for himself, the fact that he does not want the tame life of an Englishman living in England, but rather that he wants to go out into the world, is also seen as indicative of the kind of system and nature which nurtured all those who took part in the colonial enterprise of Great Britain. That people who did not want to stay in the little island kingdom, England, and instead they wanted to move out, to move on, and they wanted profits. Now, they did not want to go out into the world and then live lives of poverty. They were interested in going out and making enough money to live a comfortable middle-class life, if not a comfortable upper-class life. So, Robinson Crusoe then also is symbolic of those kinds of people. And it leads him from a comfortable life in England, in the bosom of his family, to a life of isolation and solitude. But, and this is where it becomes again interesting, that isolation and solitude is transformed from him because of his strong spiritual faith. And in fact, if you read Robinson Crusoe, there are several sections where he goes on about how God, providence, whatever you want to call it, that belief in providence is what helps him to struggle against the utter hopelessness, the loneliness that afflicts him on that island. Now, that strong faith which we see is again one of the characteristics of the empire builders, that they believed it was their mission to take religion and go into areas which did not then know that religion. He is in that sense a true colonizer, and he knows perfectly well how to rule other people, how to exploit other people, and for that always the example of Zuri initially is useful, because Zuri and he both slaves, one escapes slavery, the other continues to be sold as a slave, and eventually how to then live in a world wherein the white man is seen as superior. Now, Friday as a character, of course, he is the colonized, emblematic of the colonized, but he is also the cultural other of Crusoe. And Crusoe rescues him from his fellow cannibals. Now, when we think of Friday, what we are also looking at is somebody who is one with a bunch of cannibals, but later on, because he was about to be eaten and Crusoe rescues him, he prefers Crusoe and he looks at Crusoe with, of course, reverence, almost worship, and immense gratitude. So when he gets Friday, he does not only get a companion, but also who gets a subject. He gets somebody who is willing to subject himself to his master and who submits constantly and is happy to call Crusoe master. 2 or 3 points related to Friday which are interesting. First of all, of course, the name, that he got him on a Friday. But Friday is also important because if you were to look at the story of creation in the Bible, then man is created on Friday. And when we think of that, then Friday is somebody who can be seen as symbolic of original man. A man who is pre-lapsarian, who has not yet fallen. And if you look at the descriptions of Friday in the text, he's seen as somebody who's actually very attractive. He's cheerful, he's beautiful, but he's also good to look at. And therefore, then Friday is typical of or symbolic of pre-lapsarian man, man before the fall. And that man before the fall is taken by Crusoe and then tamed. So he takes a cannibal, and when he meets this cannibal, Crusoe then learns about cannibalism, but he also learns about his own religion, Friday's religion, the pagan religion or the heathen religion, if you want to call it that. But what does Friday get in return? Friday gets quite a few things. One, he gets the English language. Two, he gets the Christian civilization, Christian religion. And he learns civility and he learns how to be a subject. So when we look at what the mission of the colonizer was when they came to countries such as India or when they went into the countries of Africa, what they went with was an idea of civilizing the people, giving them a culture and giving them a language, as well as, of course, giving them the true religion in opposition to the false religions which they followed. And all of those are done by Robinson Crusoe for Friday. So Friday then, when he meets Robinson Crusoe, meets a colonizer and takes on those aspects which the colonizer thinks are good for him. Now there is of course Zuri, and then there are the other subjects within the text as well. Now Zuri, who is the servant on the slave ship where Crusoe himself served as a slave, is also the person who stands for the black man who will always continue to be a slave as long as there is a white man around who will exploit him. Now, when Crusoe and Zuri escape, they become good friends. They are companions. And yet, eventually, Zuri is sold. So that selling of Zuri then is what is important in that relationship. Then you have Friday's father and the Spanish captain, both of whom are again rescued by Robinson Crusoe, and the Spanish captain remains unnamed. So we only know him as the Spanish captain. Now these are the other two subjects whom Crusoe has in his little island kingdom. And when they are rescued, he sees them always both as subjects as well as threats to his power, especially the Spanish captain, because he is always uncertain as to how the Spanish captain, who is Catholic, will react to his very strong Protestant self. Now, main themes within the text. There are two major themes which run through the text, and one is, of course, the theme of the self. And for that, again, we will be looking at the ways in which Robinson Crusoe constructs himself and the new form of the novel itself. Now, through the new form, common people became the proper subject for literature, and this is something which goes back to ideas of realism, ideas of the middle class, which had learned how to read and write, which was newly literate and wanted to read not about kings and queens and about high-class people, but wanted to read about themselves in literature. And if you think about it, the novel as a form is one which gives us the ordinary man and his life and his struggles, not the lives of kings and queens. If earlier forms of literature, whether it was drama or poetry, gave us high-class people, then the novel gave us ordinary people. If Pamela and Clarissa gave us stories of serving maids whose virtue was then made an attempt on by their master, these are the stories of very ordinary middle-class, lower middle-class people whose lives was seen as interesting by those who were reading about it. Now, Robinson Crusoe, of course, also can be viewed as a capitalist who belonged to a new economic order. And this new economic order is one which prizes individual freedom, both in terms of economics, but also in terms of the freedom of the individual to do what he or she wants rather than what society expects him to do. And all collective units, whether it was a family, the church, or society, was not seen as central. Instead, it was the individual who was seen as central. This is also in keeping with the rise of the Protestant movement during this period, because the Protestants believed that the individual is at the center of the world rather than systems which are at the center. So the primacy of the individual human being as opposed to, say, the primacy of the church or the primacy of the family. Like we see, he first of all gets rid of the family. Then he gets rid of society in general. Eventually, he is left only with himself and with his faith in providence. And that's when he again starts collecting other people around him. So the importance of an individual and the individual's daily life is then the subject matter of this new form, the novel, that is symbolic of the rise of the middle class in this current society as well. And then, of course, there is a theme of the colonial myth or post-colonial readings, all of which take Robinson Crusoe as a central text because of the Crusoe-Friday relationship, but also because of the ways in which Crusoe interacts with all the people that he sees. Now, when we look at Crusoe and his interactions, whether it is with earlier people like Zuri, or later on once he comes to his own island with Friday's father, the Spanish captain, and finally the mutineers. Crusoe is always the one who is in a superior position. He's the one who rescues people. He's the one who decides how they should live their life. He's the one who is in command. He's never the one who is uncertain or whose decisions are taken for him by somebody else. He is the one who decides that when the mutinying ship comes to shore and he rescues those people, he's the one who decides what should be done over there. So this then is what we see when the post-colonial looks at Robinson Crusoe as a text. He says that Crusoe teaches Friday the word master even before teaching him yes or no. And he tells him, that is my name. Master is what you call me. Right? So the master-subject relationship is put in place right there. So along with his imperialist spirit, we also have this master-subject kind of spirit, and it does not allow him to see Friday as either an equal or a companion. It is always in a position of inferiority that he looks then at Friday. There are, of course, other themes which have been commented upon by critics as well, and these include the role of capitalism and individualism in the shaping of Crusoe's career, the fact that there are no women characters, and there is, of course, that one widow lady who keeps his money intact for him, but she is practically negligible. Then the theme of alienation from society, which we see over and over again, religion as central to the way in which Crusoe sees himself, and Friday's conversion, which is important because we see pagan/heathen relationships devalued, and we see the exalting of the Christian relationship as well. So now we are at the end of our discussion of Robinson Crusoe, and we've covered some ground. We've looked at the rise of the novel, but we've also looked at what exactly the plot is, why it is crucial for an understanding of post-colonialism, and why post-colonial writers have seen it as being so important. We've also considered the major characters and the major themes within the text. Thank you.